Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I'm not a star, although I'm very often mistaken for the moon. Not necessarily because of my lack of hair, but because I only go out at night and I've got a face cratered and pitted. And I'm frequently eclipsed. And in a way that's appropriate, because not this week, but for 3 weeks starting next week here on Musical Talk, we're going to be talking about the evergreen show Anything Goes in some depth. We'll be looking at the context, the plot, the musical production and the songs in a great deal of depth. And why is it appropriate for the slight piece of nonsense I gave at the beginning of the episode? Well, of course, Anything Goes features a character called Moonface Martin, which of course led me to think about songs involving the moon. Now, there are hundreds, of course. The old adage about Moon and June being a lazy songwriter's couplet of rhymes is actually true. And when it comes to songs about the moon, almost any angle can be taken. I think by far the most ridiculous one has got to be I Threw a Beanbag at the Moon. It does exist, I haven't made this up, it's a genuine recording from the 1930s, but the first question you've got to ask yourself is why would you write a song called I Threw a Beanbag at the Moon? As yet, I have no answer. And sadly, the song isn't even that good or enjoyable to listen to. A much better song is the very much more famous How High the Moon, which has indeed had a constellation of covers. My favourite is by a man called Slim Gaillard, and if you ever get a chance to find his version, Slim Gaillard singing How High the Moon, make sure you give yourself a chance to hear it. It's fabulous, because it's strange. He makes it a very odd, abstract, absurdist comedy jazz song, which of course is not at all the intention. And I happen to know that on the very night that the Earth reached the moon in 1969, the BBC on the radio played Slim Gaillard's version of How High the Moon as a very strange tribute to the enormous events taking place that day. But the song How High the Moon was written for a revue. It's not a standalone song. It comes from a musical revue written in 1940 called Two for the Show, starring Alfred Drake, one of the great names of musical theatre at that time. Now, the song is written by somebody called Nancy Hamilton, who wrote the lyrics, and Morgan Lewis, who wrote the music. And the interesting thing about Two for the Show, the musical revue from 1940, is that it was the middle one of 3 shows. There was a musical revue called One for the Money in 1939, which was such a success it was followed up with Two for the Show, 1940, as we've already established. And then, because America went into the war in 1941, the third one in the sequence, in the hat-trick if you like, was called Three to Make Ready, and it didn't appear until 1946. But the writing partnership of Nancy Hamilton and Morgan Lewis is not really very famous, but they did attempt to write a musicalised version of Mary Poppins, and they started work on that in the 1930s as a vehicle for Beatrice Lillie, another big star of that period. Now, as we know that everybody seems to have had a crack at Mary Poppins at some time, not just for Disney Corporation and the magnificent Sherman Brothers, but we all know that Stephen Sondheim had a go at it when he was a young man as a writing exercise. Now, the interesting thing about the Nancy Hamilton-Morgan Lewis version of Mary Poppins is, of course, that it wasn't produced. And no songs have ever escaped from it in a recorded version except one. And it's a very strange song indeed. And when you know what the lyrics of the song are and its title, you will think, how on earth does that fit into the story of Mary Poppins? And the song is called A Horse Called Margaret. And the reason it was recorded is once again due to pure happenstance. You may have heard of a man called Ben Bagley. Now, Ben Bagley was a producer of musical revues in the 1950s, who in his later career went on to record albums, and I should say they were LPs, of obscure and lost songs by some of the great composers of the 20th century. If you can ever find his George Gershwin Revisited, it's well worth a listen, but he also did Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, Frank Lesser, Noel Coward. He really went through the wider catalogue of songwriters of the 20th century, and all his albums are well worth hearing, although they are as eccentric as he is. He was a man who insisted on being photographed with his cat for the sleeve cover notes. But in 1979 he reissued one of his albums, which was essentially a recording of Broadway offcuts and songs which never quite made it into final shows, and he stumbled across Nancy Hamilton and Morgan Lewis's version of Mary Poppins, and in particular the song A Horse Called Margaret. Now, for reasons which are not absolutely clear, he decided to ask the very elderly actress Katharine Hepburn to record it. Now, Katharine Hepburn had of course been in the failed musical Coco some years beforehand, but in this 1979 recording, Nancy Hamilton very kindly wrote some additional lyrics for Katharine Hepburn to sing, and Katharine Hepburn, I must say, does give a very characterful performance. She actually does the song a great deal of justice, although singing is very clearly not one of her main fortes. And I must say the song is very comic as well. Katharine Hepburn really does play the comedy chops in her Sprechsangen version of A Horse Called Margaret. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is all very interesting, and what an obscure path through the backwaters of musical history, and you'd be right. But the second question, which I don't think you've actually stated, but I know is there, judgmentally looking at me, is, but how on earth does this fit with this week's episode of Musical Talk? Well, the song was called A Horse Called Margaret. And of course the connection between horses and musical theatre is not necessarily very strong. But as you heard in last week's episode of Musical Talk, Nick Hudson has been to see such a thing. It's Only Fools and Horses, the musical, which is a British musical which opened in London's West End in 2019, survived COVID, and is packing them in still in 2022 and seems likely to be booking forward into the future. Now, it isn't actually at all about horses, the musical Only Fools and Horses, the musical. It is, of course, a musicalised version of a long-standing British situation comedy from the 1980s. But the phrase Only Fools and Horses is, in fact, actually a phrase from the American West, and it relates to stubborn people, because only fools and horses do stupid things. And there are a plethora of variants on Only Fools and Horses work. Only fools and horses will do this, only fools and horses would do that. It's a sign of stupidity through stubbornness. And so, using that magic combination of stupidity and stubbornness, this week's episode is also about Only Fools and Horses, the musical. Now, last week you heard Nick Hudson talking about it with me, and he wasn't magnificently overwhelmed by it as a piece of musical theatre. He thought it was a very good stage comedy, but he didn't really rate it as a musical. This week, I'm pleased to say, we'll be hearing a very different side to the same show, from our old friend and my friend, Josh Clark. Now, Josh went to see it in London only recently as part of the London Theatre Week, which is actually a fortnight when they reduce prices in order to try to get people into theatre. So in this week's episode, we'll be hearing a conversation between Josh and myself recorded just after London Theatre Week, brackets, fortnight, close brackets, ended, in which we discuss London Theatre Week and the implications of price increases and decreases on people attending theatre, and whether or not it actually will have a good effect in terms of bringing people into the theatre who might not normally go, which of course is the holy grail for theatre. And then we'll be talking about his views of Only Fools and Horses, which are, on the whole, very positive. So, you've had a very long introduction from me, although I hope a faintly picturesque one, if meandering. So it's time, I think, to start to fly like the crow, or to move like the fool or the horse in a straight line, regardless of consequences, and get into this week's episode, which is a conversation with the ever-lovely Josh Clark about London Theatre Week and Only Fools and Horses, the musical. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Josh, can I say how wonderful it is to see you here in London, and doubly so to know that what we have in prospect is a wonderful conversation about musical theatre. This is no surprise for anyone who listens to Musical Talk on a regular basis, and of course from your devoted fans, of which there are many, I am one, who want to hear you talking about musical theatre. But first, how are you?
Hello Thos as well, and many thanks indeed for inviting me back onto Musical Talk, our kind of annual
it is.
Summary of things that have been going on. I'm very well indeed, and looking forward to spending some time talking about some shows that we've seen together and some that we've seen apart recently.
And you mentioned summary. We are recording this right at the end of summer, so that's exactly how the weather conditions are. But that's merely an aside and probably irrelevant. But there is something that happens in summer every year in relation to West End theatre. I think that would be the kind of theatre that's most affected by it, which you've been really making something of this year. And that's London Theatre Week. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Well, indeed, London Theatre Week, that fantastic misnomer for a fortnight in the capital, where West End shows, musicals largely, but plays as well, greatly reduced their ticket prices. So there seem to be 3 bands this year, £15, £25 and £35, which, as we both know, and I'm sure listeners will be all too well aware, is quite a steep climb down from some of the prices that are touted usually, really. So yes, I've been trying to take advantage of that this week in particular for me, and trying to pack in a few shows I might not have seen otherwise.
Yes, and I think you make a good point, but it really highlights something, doesn't it, which is that theatre prices, particularly now, post-COVID, where theatres are obviously trying to make sure their financial sustainability and long-term longevity is assured as far as they can do, have had to recognise an increase in prices, and that's always pushed on to those of us who want to go to theatre. But of course it also works against theatre, because the higher it goes, the more it pushes people away from theatre. It certainly pushes those of us who love theatre to go less often. You're quite right, and these weeks are very welcome, and there was a sale earlier in the year when we went to see a couple of shows, and these things are very welcome, but it's a sad reflection of the current economic situation, and particularly in theatrical show business, that actually those of us who love theatre and musical theatre still have to ration our resources and can only afford to go X number of times, and events like this really help. But do they bring in new people? Or is it for those of us who are sort of veterans, do you think? I mean, I'm not asking you to have done the analysis. But
well, no, you're right to touch on all of that. And I think there are a few different strands to all of this as well, because you're quite right that we all acknowledge all of the costs that is involved in putting on these shows. And we certainly don't begrudge money going to pay the actors and the band, as I always talk about on here seemingly. But if you want a good live orchestra, then you have to
pay for it.
You have to pay for it, and there's a myriad of people involved. The show that I saw last night, looking at the credits in the programme, there's a double page spread of size 6 font of all the people who are involved, and they can't be working for free.
Crew and producers, and of course just the infrastructure of the building. Theatres cost money to maintain as a premises, whether they've got people in them or not.
Exactly. So you've got that, and you touched there on COVID as well. So a lot of money needs to be recouped by these shows, of course. So that's another competing thing. But yes, audiences, and we all know very keenly at the moment, are not made of money, and it's certainly not getting any better. So the theatres have to balance the money that they're taking in with bringing audiences in. Now, after a 2-year layoff, as you put it, the veterans are going to come back, because we've all missed it.
Yes.
And we've availed ourselves of the online offerings and such like, but there's nothing like being back in the theatre.
There is nothing like being back in the theatre.
But for a lot of people, probably the sort of luxury aspect of going to the theatre is very easy to cut out of your life when you need to be saving money, of course. And it's absolutely, I would suggest, the wrong time for new people to start going, because why would you at the moment? So I think London Theatre Week is a fantastic initiative,
and we applaud it.
Certainly applaud it, and it would be fantastic if we could one day get to an economic climate where the £15, £25, £35 tickets were the norm rather than the exception, because it seems like a reasonable price to pay, doesn't it? But
I'd to be honest, if tickets were £35, I'd be going to theatre 2 or 3 times a week rather than once a month or fewer at the moment. I'm lucky, and so are you. You and I often go to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and the great thing about that is you get a hell of a lot of theatre for very reduced prices. But of course you are getting minimal theatre, black box theatre and almost no props and almost no set and minimal cast, but you're getting the theatrical experience. And that's the wonderful place. I think fringe festivals and things like that are a fabulous way of getting a lot of theatre for relatively less money. Though then there's the accommodation costs in Edinburgh, which are a different thing again. But when it comes to sort of West End commercial theatre, it is harder to be bringing in new audiences. And actually, I think it's quite interesting that, and in a way, this is a segue, I suppose, because I happen to know one of the shows you've been to see, but one of the successes in London at the moment is a show based on a very popular British long-running sitcom, Only Fools and Horses. But even that isn't a surefire way of getting people who might not come to the theatre to see a show in London. I remember it was only a few years ago since I Can't Sing, the X Factor musical, came in. And I know there was quite a lot of hope that was going to bring in people who watch the X Factor on television to, think I might have a slice of that up in London at the Palladium. But the problem was, it didn't really bring people in, and it closed much earlier than it deserved to, because actually it turned out to have been a fabulous show. I really enjoyed it, but it's difficult to get new people in, I suppose, is the story I'm trying to get at. And there are two ways of doing it. You can try and put products on which you think are going to appeal to a wider audience than usual, and perhaps Only Fools and Horses, the musical, is an example of that, but whether it's been successful is another matter. Doing that, it's been successful as a show because it's been running a long time now. And the other way of doing it, of course, is bringing out all the old war horses. It's not for nothing, I suspect, that the English National Opera put My Fair Lady on for a limited run earlier in 2022. And we're getting to see a lot of shows coming back which are no real surprise, are the modern perennials, if you like, because they're bankable, to be brutal.
And the two shows, yes, Only Fools and Horses and also Anything Goes so far this week, have both had moments in them where they have explicitly given a nod and a wink to the audience, acknowledging the cost of going to watch it, and reflecting on that. I think I detect almost a note of gratitude from the cast that the audiences have been coming.
They're still, yes. It's also complicit, though, isn't it? There's a kind of acknowledgement that actually theatre has become a luxury, and that's a terrible thing.
Well, it is, and a lot of the background to Anything Goes, I suppose, was the cultural theatrical zeitgeist at the time it was being written was cabaret, and or the early onset of, at least in the 30s, and it was satire, wasn't it? It was political ribaldry, but it was a low form of culture, cheaply accessible to the masses to be able to go and be entertained. And if you wanted to go and get a West End ticket to the cabaret show that's on at the moment, it probably has gone a little bit away from those roots. But
completely. But theatre in general, not just musical theatre, was doing a lot more in the past. But that's because there were fewer things to see. If you didn't want to go to the music halls or variety theatres as they became, and they were dead by 1960 in real terms, you had the films, and that's good, and you had nascent television, and I think television is the thing that knocks theatre away, actually, because it's unbelievable. People like Alistair Sim were appearing in plays in the 1950s, which was a two-hander. It was him and another actor, and he's a teacher, and they're discussing, as part of this play, improvements in education. National education policy as a play, two-hander, and people were flocking to see these shows in the early 1950s. And then suddenly Coronation Street comes along, presumably, or whatever. And, when television really takes off in the late 50s, early 60s, post-Coronation, from Coronation to Coronation Street, I suppose, is the two big steps of television in the 1950s in Britain. I suspect you'd struggle to get that kind of show on at all. And if you did, would you get an audience these days?
Well,
theatre just isn't important, I suppose, is what I'm saying in the way it was. Sorry.
No, and without making this too sort of political, but society is quite divided along very polarised lines now, isn't it? So
it is.
Perhaps it might not be a way to bring in a lot of people, because if it doesn't fit in with what you already think, maybe you don't go and see it.
Well, I think yes. You're right. Are people interested in exploring ideas? And if they are, where are they going to do that? They're going to watch it on television. They're not going to go to the theatre, I suspect. But we have deviated a little bit from our position, which is starting off with the role of London Theatre Week. But it is to get people to go to the theatre. That is essentially what it is. So thematically, we're still on. But we appreciate that we probably I suspect that people listening to this episode want to hear rather more about the shows that you've seen, Josh, than necessarily our theories on the decline of theatre in Britain in the last 70 years or so. So you've mentioned that you saw a couple of things. We're going to talk about one of them, I think, in relative depth, but I've not seen Only Fools and Horses, the musical, which is the one that's based on the British sitcom from the 80s and 90s. What did you make of it?
Well, I really enjoyed it, and I went to it from a position of already enjoying the television series, which...
The core material, the source material.
Of course, and I think you can go to it without that and still enjoy it, but there are an awful lot of references, and the characters are being played to, as accurately as possible, mimic, the original portrayals on screen. And
so it's not a reimagination, is what you're telling me. It's definitely true to its original roots quite closely. And it was originally being written by John Sullivan. Oh, right.
With I was going to say with Paul Whitehouse, but that might not be fully accurate, but we can go back and check that. But certainly the idea came from the original writer of the television programme, who unfortunately didn't get to see out the completion of the project. So it's his son who has taken it on.
Oh, right, okay.
And he, for sure, was then working with Paul Whitehouse to write everything. And it was Chaz and Dave who they collaborated with on the music.
Interesting, because one of those has also since passed away.
Yes, Dave?
I wouldn't know.
Don't know. But anyway, it was very lovingly created, and they, of course, watched back all of the original episodes. And in fact, the story of the musical is based upon the episode where Del Boy meets Raquel.
His long-term female partner, ultimately.
Yes, no spoilers there, is there?
Not after 20, 30 years.
No. So if you are a fan of the original series, then probably already, with us just starting to talk about it, you will be thinking of iconic moments.
You will.
And lines and episodes. And I would say if you are thinking of one of those, it probably is in the show. So there's lots of moments of recognition and nostalgia, I suppose.
There's a touch of the best of in this, is it?
Yes.
So make sure it does the point-to-point on the big stuff.
Absolutely. And sometimes you see it coming and it's telegraphed, and a lot of it is done with a nod and a wink.
Yeah.
But we're all, like you said earlier, complicit in that, all enjoying it together.
We're also hardwired to enjoy certain scenes because we've seen them so often. There comes a point. Comedy is often based, psychologically on the sudden realisation of the unexpected happening. But of course, when you know that Del Boy is going to fall through the opened bar, because we've seen it 1,000 times, it's one of the most played clips of comedy on television in this country to this day. It's still funny, but that's because we've sort of become hardwired to it. It's interesting how comedy changes and we react to it from muscle memory almost as well.
That's right, and they certainly play on that moment, as you'd expect in the show here. And in fact, it's the moments where you think he's about to fall through the bar, but then doesn't.
Clever. That's the unexpected. That's the twist. Oh, you see, that's clever though, isn't it? I like that as a thought-through way of doing it.
That's right. But it's clearly done with love by people who know the show intimately. But it's not to say that it's exactly like the television programme as well. Of course, we've got the inclusion of musical numbers, some of which are from the TV show, because the theme tune, it becomes a song in its own right.
Does it?
Oh, yeah.
How do they do that? Do you mind me asking? Is it diegetic in the sense of someone saying, we're going to sing this song now, everybody, and then it's the Only Fools and Horses theme tune? Or is it... Because it strikes me that's very difficult to suggest that's someone's inner voice.
No, it's a scene-setting song. It almost plays the same function, actually.
As a theme tune?
Yes, almost. And it comes quite early on, but then reappears as a bit of a motif to Peckham as we move through the whole thing.
There's a sentence I wasn't expecting to hear today.
This is where we go on musical talk, isn't it?
The Peckham leitmotif, said Wagner.
He may have done it at some point. But there are occasional characters, too, who... are new to the stage musical, and there's one in particular who is, well, let me say a series of characters all played by the same actor on stage, who almost steals the show, which you wouldn't expect to happen, where you're looking for Del Boy and Rodney and Boycey and Trigger.
The iconic characters, quite, yeah.
That's right. So they've done a good job of having these supplementary characters just bringing out another element of the new, which is why I say I think you can enjoy that without...
Yes.
necessarily having prior knowledge.
But let's talk a little bit more about the songs. Obviously, Chaz and Dave bring to me a certain kind of sort of, funny enough, I would say Cockney way of singing, but Peckham's not East London, but I suppose London these days is a little bit more homogenous than it used to be. So it would work. I can see that. It gives you a London feel, let's put it that way. And it's interesting that you're describing that the central plot points for the main characters are the love relationship, such as it is. So actually, in that sense, it follows a very traditional path of boy meets girl, even if the boy and the girl are middle-aged. And there are other pairings as well, aren't there, as well? But I suppose, looking at the source material as a sitcom, it's not immediately apparent that actually that the characters... How would you put songs in? And yet, I suppose, I'm just working this through as I talk to you, really. I suspect the draw is the fact that the sitcom was so long-lived on television and so beloved. And actually those characters transcended their material and became characters in their own right. You could meet we still use Del Boy as a terminology for an archetype. And I suspect it's that sense of them being part of the wider family of anyone who watched it at the time or subsequently. That, we feel we know them. And those characters were so beautifully performed by those actors that actually, if we've already got flesh on the bone when we meet the characters, it doesn't matter if the original material is sort of inspired from sitcom, which is not to suggest sitcom is anything other than a very cleverly form of writing, but it isn't where you think there's depth. But I suppose the depth is brought by the context of the series rather than the context of the episode. Would that make sense?
Definitely. And Only Fools and Horses, we don't get too grandiose about it, but it
Too
is,
late, I think.
Yeah, it is social commentary.
It is,
isn't
yes.
it? And the musical has been updated to reflect not only when it was originally set, but also 2022.
So it's got the flavour of the zeitgeist.
Definitely, because Peckham, of course, has transformed now, hasn't it, and been gentrified and all that sort of thing.
Because it was run down in the original series.
Completely. Well, they lived in Nelson Mandela Tower, didn't they?
Yes.
And all sitcoms rely on the notion of the protagonist being trapped. That's how the comedy works. They just can't get out of their situation.
The sit of the com, in fact.
Right, exactly. And we have one rather esoteric number in the musical where Trigger brings out a crystal ball and he can see the future. And there's a big song about looking at the real craft ale makers now in Peckham and the artisan bread makers, and they're all thinking what Peckham is going to become. Similarly, Grandad, early on in the show, sings "Where Have All the Cockneys Gone?"
Oh, right, because they've been pushed out by gentrification.
And it's some went here, some went there.
Here, there, everywhere a Cockney. Yes,
right,
no, that's a different song.
But not too far removed, let me say. It does invite you to reflect on how London has changed and how people therefore have changed in the 40 or so years that it spans now.
Well, that is interesting, because you're right, because it's almost having its cake and eating it, isn't it? And I like the idea that by a sudden moment of clairvoyance, that actually it allows you a touch of satire and compare and contrast, because actually I would still argue that that's progress, that this, that Peckham as is surpassed by Peckham as is, and yet every piece of progress also loses something. And there, I suppose, where you are in your response to that loss.
Absolutely. And what I did notice, I don't know whether this was a consequence of London Theatre Week or whether it was just a consequence of the nature of the show, but sitting in the theatre, I could hear people immediately sitting around me who I would say were there because it was Only Fools and Horses, not because we're going to have a night out at the theatre, it's because, we love this thing. Horses. Yeah. And the chap sitting directly behind me, when Grandad sang that first line, "Where have all the Cockneys gone?" shouted out, "Where?" So it was that
a connection.
Feel, yeah.
Oddly, isn't that interesting? Because the resonance, the way you explain that to me, unless that fella's there every day and shouts it out every time, that, fun enough, connects us, I think, with old-fashioned music hall, the pre-variety thing that we were talking about a little bit earlier, which, of course, whilst was nationwide, started in London and is often perceived as a London form of art, well, certainly a London form of theatre. The biggest and the greatest music halls, start with the Eagle, down in the south of London, actually, I think, rather than the east of London, I think, but not a million miles from where we're recording this, actually. I think it was relatively close to Waterloo, so we're at the Royal Festival Hall. It's an homage. But actually, that idea but the thing about music hall, of course, is the interaction. The only thing you really see anything like that today is pantomime. And even the interaction in pantomime is usually troped, in the sense what the call marks are where you're supposed to respond, Whereas actually in the musical, and you see it in heckling actually, I suppose, where actually audiences let you know if they like or don't like, or can just sort of converse with you, and the performers on stage would have historically been able to respond to that. Was there a response? I mean, obviously if Grandad was singing the song, then presumably he wasn't able to break off and respond to your member of the public, but...
No, the song carried on, but you could hear just snippets of conversation around of...
oh, I remember that.
Yeah,
yes.
that sort of thing, and people saying the lines before the characters did, and
oh, really? Oh, right.
And joining in very much with the that famous theme tune song. All around me, people were singing that.
Really?
With the actors, yeah.
No income tax, no VAT. No money back, no guarantee.
That's
Goodness, isn't that interesting? Because I actually haven't watched an episode for many years, and here it is, absolutely lodged in the brain.
Yeah, I found that as well. I knew every word.
Isn't that odd?
Mm-hmm. But catchy music, isn't it?
Yeah, catchy music, and a certain kind of lyric which lingers as well. You know, you could. I'm sure you could put words in there which would be so anodyne as not to be remembered, because it's a song that's doing even in the theme tune, it's doing something. So, were there any other songs that sort of stuck out for you? Even if they were sort of Cockney sing-alongs, or maybe let me rephrase this another way. You've said the audience had a natural response to it. Were there any other areas where that was encouraged? They didn't have a Cockney sing-along at the end, or anything?
Not quite like that, but there were moments where the fourth wall was completely broken, and the actors were mostly interacting with the front row, but then by extension everyone. There's one where there's a scene set up the theatre where Rodney is meeting Cassandra for an evening, and he comes in via the wrong entrance, so it looks like for a moment he's going to climb over the tops of everyone in the front row to get over to her. So we are brought into their world. That's a nice thing. I think probably the two songs I've already mentioned are the ones that stand out. Number one, Grandad's Where Have All the Cockneys Gone, for its Chas and Daviness and
the adjective we've all been looking for these years.
Yeah, and the resonance, and actually that one has been used in a lot of the promotional material as well. So we know that one. But then the trigger song, just because it stands out so much, it's a very odd thing, this moment of clairvoyance, but it's not
Trigger
out of keeping with him.
Yeah, Trigger is the character who would have the odd moments. He's the left field thinker anyway, isn't he? So
40 years on, he's still calling Rodney Dave.
Do you know, it's so odd because, I don't want this to become a conversation about the series, but it's odd what comes back. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this as a series, although I have a great deal of affection for it, and yet I can remember the time where Zell buys Rodney a kind of arm bracelet, and it's engraved to say Rodney, except that the engraving isn't sufficiently good, and everyone says, why does it say Rooney? And that's just a little throwaway joke which doesn't have huge resonance, because I don't think it was picked up as a big thing from the series at the time, and yet I found it so funny as a child and as a young man that here I am X number of years later, and that's just popped into my brain.
I'll tell you what, there was almost one moment, just a personal touch here, there was almost one moment where I and I alone almost shouted out in the middle of the audience, and that was when Grandad was in hospital giving a very extended, verbose, piled up list of Cockney slang for a particular ailment that he was suffering, and it must have been about 12th on the list of ways he was trying to get Del to understand what he was suffering from, and he said, I'm in here from a Plymouth Argyles, and I almost whooped in my seat to hear that wonderful reference. I'm sure loyal listeners will be able to work out the ailment.
I don't think you need to be a loyal listener to work out the ailment from Plymouth Argyles. It was known as Chalfont St Giles, where I was.
I'm sure that was in there as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, well, of course, that's your favoured team, isn't it?
Of course.
So, yes, quite. And you can't. People can't see, as we're recording this, the glee on your face.
Well, I was delighted. Yeah.
So overall, Only Fools and Horses is not for fools.
No, nor horses. And it got better and better as it went on, actually. So
now, is that because it got better, or you felt more comfortable with the material being transcended into a musical?
I'll tell you what it is, actually. I hadn't thought about this before, but of course, if you do know the programme, as 95% of people will, as soon as you see each character for the first time, you are immediately comparing them with,
of course,
the actors, aren't you?
The original television ones. Yeah.
Exactly. And they mostly bear up very, very, very well indeed. Some fantastic casting. But we're probably all a little bit nervous and on edge at the beginning. So when we settle in and we allow ourselves to now just think, oh, it isn't David Jason, but it is Del Boy.
Yeah.
and you can just enjoy it. So I think there was part of that for me.
It's easing into the character performances. Yeah, no, I understand that entirely. I mean, once again, sitcom, although not as a musical. The 3 missing episodes of Dad's Army were recently recreated with new performers. And for the most part, it's pretty good. It only took me a few minutes into the first episode to be in rhythm with what they were doing, and finding that rhythm was in accordance with and simpatico with my understandings of the rhythm of the original series. That's a complicated sentence. What I meant was it felt right.
Yes, not quite.
But so it can be done. So yes,
it can be done.
So do you think, funnily enough, if you went to see it a second time, that initial nervousness would be gone, and in fact actually you'd be more speech marks relaxed at the beginning?
If I went to see it tonight,
yes,
then yes. But they are about to have a new cast again,
of course,
for the final couple of months of the run. In which case, you probably do go through that again.
Yes, I suppose so. Yeah.
But I don't think it's a bad thing either, because it's all adding to your enjoyment. Because you want what you're seeing there and then to be as close as possible, because you are there full of nostalgia.
That's why you've done it in most cases. Yes, absolutely.
So congratulations to them all for making it so easy to relax into it.
Well, Josh, thank you very much indeed. We started off with London Theatre Week, and I know you've been really making something of it, and yet we've only managed to talk about one show because it was so engrossing talking to you about Only Fools and Horses. So I'd like to say thank you very much for explaining that to me. It's a show I've not seen, but you've really whetted my appetite for it. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation, which will be about the other show you saw, which was Anything Goes, and we'll be settling down to talk about that for next week.
Looking forward to it.
Musical talk. Well, there we have it. The conversation with Josh Clark about Only Fools and Horses, the musical, which of course you heard he very much enjoyed. And I think it's always wonderful to hear different views on the same show, particularly if they're not in agreement. Nick Hudson didn't think much of it as a musical. Josh clearly did. Which just goes to show that the wonderful thing about musical theatre is that it can generate all these different views and opinions. You may or may not agree with them, but the opinions that you hear, or that you have yourself, or that I have, are always valid. And wouldn't it be dull if we always had the same view? It might be dull even if we don't, but at least there's a greater chance of it not being. Well, I think that brings this episode of Musical Talk to an end. As I said towards the beginning, for the next 3 weeks we've got a wonderful 3-part investigation into that evergreen musical by Cole Porter, one of the great musical writers of the interwar period, and beyond in fairness, called Anything Goes. It's been perpetually revived for nearly 90 years now, so I think it's entirely appropriate that we look at a show which some people might say is a throwaway piece of fluff, and that is certainly an interpretation. But it's obviously got something. So let's try and find out over the next 3 weeks why. And I do hope you'll join me for that longer conversation, which is also with the ever insightful Josh Clark. Until then, I think it's time to give you a week's run-up, or at least a rest, and the best way of doing that until next week's episode is published is for me to stop broadcasting. And to be honest, stopping broadcasting is much more easily done if I'm not talking. And there's a way to stop me talking, and I don't mean violent attacks or tape across the mouth. I do mean me voluntarily giving it up by saying one word which generally brings everything to a full stop. And that is the following word. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos and Josh Clark, and edited by Thos. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, You can at Musical Talk Thos. Do you want to just sort of, you see, because I'm doing that quiet thing at the moment, but I'm sure we'll get more normal once we feel more relaxed, actually.
Yes, so you're looking at the level here.
I am.
So if I go at something like this, 1, 2, 3, probably about all right.
Yeah, that looks good to me. I will periodically check the gauge.
If I need to go down, just go.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, I think you...
Yeah.
Yeah, quite. I want you to pan across the microphone. I want you to circle it, actually.
Musical talk in surround sound. Literally.
2 ears is enough, I think.
Musical talk.
Hello. Yes, I'm coming to you from one of the, what do they used to be called? Teacup rides?
Yeah.
Or dodgem car? Yeah, you know the kind of thing that swings you back and forth. Yeah, oh yeah, quite. Recording this on a centrifuge.